Welcome back, everyone. And next session is also a reflection of the challenging times we're facing at the moment. And it's all about how it's even more important to respect rights in times of uncertainty and to look at how that might be achieved. And this session is led once more by Dan Wiedemann. Dan, I'll leave you to introduce the panel.
Thanks, Neil. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I am Dan, for those of you who saw me yesterday. I am still a partner at the Working Capital Fund, which is an early stage investor. For those of you watching at home, thank you. The framing for the panel. We live in unprecedented times, though that feels like it's been true for quite a while now. Political polarization, rising authoritarianism, the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. That describes the situation globally and certainly describes my home country, the United States, since January. And as a result, the consensus that human rights belong on the global agenda, and in particular belong as part of business conduct, is under pressure and being weakened. Among the manifestations that affect those of us institutionally who are trying to fight for human rights are the weakening of legislation in the European Union that was meant to extend human rights due diligence deeper into supply chains and is now at least on pause. The elimination of hundreds of millions of dollars of funding from the US government through USAID and importantly through the International Labor Affairs Bureau of the Department of Labor. Elimination, by the way, which was opposed by the responsible business community in the United States as the elimination of a fundamental plank in support of responsible business globally. The elimination of AID funding as well, of course. This on top of the existing crises of climate change and rising wealth inequality that put pressure on the work that we're trying to do. So for those of you in the room, the panel that we succeed, that we follow, talked poignantly about the pressures that are being faced by migrant workers, particularly here in Thailand, as a result of political changes, in Myanmar especially. We're going to talk from the institutional perspective. So 3 institutions that are working to protect rights, promote rights in a time of uncertainty, and in some ways uncertainty is the least of it, in a time of actually declining support, declining consensus, and increased pressure. I am joined happily by, from left to right, Pan Roque, who is Thai Country Director for Dignity and Work for All, an organization that has pioneered responsible business conduct here in Southeast Asia, originally as part of the network of Verite. Rachel Elliott, who is General Manager of Sustainability, Impact Narrative and Human Rights for Woolworths, an Australian retailer. And Elaine Mitchell-Hill, who is International Lead Design for Freedom at the Grace Farms Foundation. Again, we're going to talk from the institutional perspective. We have to admit, I think as most of you probably feel, that this is a tough time to be doing the work that we're doing. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk specifically about the challenges that have increased, the pressures that have increased. Certainly later when we hear from you all, welcome comments from your own experiences about how your work has gotten more difficult. But, you know, we're not going to sit there too long because we can't, right? We are all also currently and in an ongoing way strategizing how to respond to the difficult situations that we institutionally find ourselves and that we personally find ourselves and that our beneficiaries or those on whose behalf we're working find themselves. And so we're going to talk also, and certainly specifically, I hope, about the ways these institutions and more generally the community as a whole has strategized to respond. So can't ignore the difficult situations that we find ourselves in, but nor can we leave it there, and nor can we stay there too long. It's not who I think we as a community are, and it's certainly not what the work deserves. But to start, let's get specific, and I'll start with Pan. When it comes to the you know, to say it nicely, the dynamic environment in which we exist right now, the chaotic environment that we experience right now, what are you seeing that's new? What are you worried about? What are you experiencing?
Hello. Yep. Thanks, Dan, for the question, and thank you for having me on the panel, and thank you to the organizers for organizing the event. Yeah, well, there are several things that come to mind when we think of this new era. As you mentioned, we have the global tariffs that are currently taking place, the defunding of USAID. Here in the neighboring country, there's an ongoing civil war and ongoing pressures. The way that kind of manifest into the context in which we operate here, I think, are several things. I think in terms of the defunding of USAID, they estimate that Myanmar is losing about 1.1 billion US dollars in terms of general aid and also humanitarian assistance, and that goes to housing support for living costs, living expenses, things that kind of help shore up the conditions there. And with that soon going away, the EU says they will be propping up some funding, but it's unlikely that it will cover the shortfall left by USAID. All of that, I think, just to echo the sentiments of other panelists before this, is it's going to make life more precarious in Myanmar, and that's adding outward pressure for migration. How that affects countries like neighboring countries like Thailand is that you'll probably likely see higher amounts of irregular migration that's coming into the country. That's going to, I think, there's an increase in brokerage activities that may exploit the vulnerabilities of migrants coming here. All that's to say, it's going to increase the risk profile of employers who look to hire migrants here. I think coupled with the situation that Max mentioned earlier about the difficulties in country registration and the regularization process of migrants here, so they create a complex set of challenges. But at the same time, you also see a lot of employers starting to implement the employer pay principle. I think in reaction to market signals among U.S. and EU buyers, they try to implement those commitments in this new context, which is proving to be quite difficult. Most of the industry codes and standards have been built around responsible recruitment in the cross-border recruitment context, but not necessarily the in-country recruitment context that has been more prevalent today. And so you have these external factors that are making the situation a bit more dynamic. And what sort of I worry about is that the progress we've made on the employer pays principle, responsible recruitment commitments may backslide or may weaken because of this context. But more to that, there's also a lot of these support networks that prop up what I call sort of the rights protection or providing an enabling environment for rights protection here in Thailand and also in Myanmar. As those get defunded, you'll have more vulnerabilities faced by workers. Yeah, you've touched upon authoritarianism as a key theme, so I'll bring up Myanmar again as well. We've noticed that in the recent rounds of regularization of migrants here in Thailand, there's been added processes and added complexity. One thing that employers say a lot in private is that they have to make sort of under-the-table facilitation payments in order for their migrant workers to continue to be documented. That has increased their cost of up to 20 to 30%, and so that's cost that is paid to under the table facilitation, to buy queues, to make sure that their workers get documented in time. So these, I think, add pressures to companies wanting to implement an employer pay principle, and it's something that needs to be, I think, discussed more widely, and something that will need to be reflected in conversations. But the last point I worry about in terms of tariffs is that we've become, especially now, very price sensitive. And so it makes it very hard for conversations around fair share models to happen. I think yesterday, Arde Kapoor talked about the importance of fostering this conversations around fair share model, which is going to be very difficult considering the current tariff situation. But for markets and for employers and for companies that have already made inroads on, let's say, the employer pay principle, the market signals need to continue to be there, and there needs to be clear signaling that EPP still has purchase, still has value in the way that buyers decide where to buy from, and that they won't leave certain markets when the costs get high. And so those market signals need to continue to be there, which is, I understand, very difficult in the current environment. So I worry about a backslide considering all of those factors. But forums like this, where we continue to reiterate our commitments and share experiences and how to find practices to help, I think are helpful to maintain that norm.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Appreciate it. The specificity of the additional challenges faced by employers, not to mention the already complicated conversations about cost share now only get a little more complicated. Elaine, turning to you, similar question. What are you specifically seeing and or most worrying about in the uncertain environment in which we sit?
Okay. I think what I'd like to do is draw attention to construction in relation to construction product and material supply chains. So often when we talk about the construction sector, we're talking about on-site labor, but not the supply of labor in terms of the products and materials which end up on construction sites. And in relation to that, we're seeing there's a massive demand on those supply chains for construction products and materials. So by 2030, I think global spending is set to reach 17.5 trillion. So with China, US, and India leading the way. And more than 60% of the global infrastructure investment is in emerging countries, specifically in Asia. So I think ultimately there's going to be there's a drive for products and materials for construction. Kind of that's one aspect. I think put on top of that the products and materials that will be required when we rebuild after conflict. I think that adds and compounds, adds another layer of weight, I guess, for those who are vulnerable, already vulnerable in supply chains. I think you've already kind of touched on this, Pan, but the protectionism, I think, that we're seeing in terms of extractive construction materials is becoming kind of really globally pronounced. And countries are imposing tariffs and quotas and restrictions on materials like steel and aluminium, lumber. And for those working in those supply chains, you know, there will be a knock-on. I think the rollback on ESG is unhelpful, but ESG, from my perspective, has never fully captured the human rights dimension. Yeah, I mean, I used to be, I guess it's helpful to know that I have worked in PLC kind of environments up until 12 months ago, so I'm fully aware of those ESG requirements, and it was still a real struggle to keep human rights on the table, even with the ESG agenda in full flight. It was always sliding off the table in favor of decarbonization. And I think probably the kind of slide in terms of ESG has made that worse. And I think in relation to what's happening as we hear governments and businesses talk about ESG, is we've seen a real rise in the political rhetoric which dehumanizes migrants and immigrants and undermines diversity, equality, inclusion. And I think what I see and I feel is it emboldening some businesses or some quarters to roll back on their promises. So that makes me very, very uncomfortable. And also I think that the construction sector, I mean, there will be exceptions, I accept that. But generally, from what I've seen in engaging internationally with the sector, is they have not yet fully engaged with labor in the global supply chain, or indeed perhaps fully, on site. Human rights due diligence still lingers at tiers 1 and tiers 2. And I'm feeling quite old, like my friend John Morrison. I was in a meeting last week where there were some people in the room, younger than me, of course, were going, well, these are some things that we perhaps will leave to the medium term. I was like, this is the medium term. Like, we've been working on this for a really, long time. And I think some of what we're not seeing needs to be addressed, and the construction sector, with my hat on, needs to respond to that.
Thank you. We'll come on to sort of some of the ways in which your program and others have a chance to respond. But I think you very nicely point out just how complicated the environment is for businesses. And luckily we have Rachel to talk to that. A similar question, what are you specifically seeing as a business that's trying to lead in the space? No doubt that's gotten more complicated.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely an interesting question. I think it's top of mind for many. I think firstly, objectively, it's certainly a complex and complicated and evolving environment that we find ourselves operating in. I think if you look at the fact there's increasing social polarization, there's increasing global conflict. Apologies, I'm going to apologize to everyone. I've been across 3 time zones in about 3 days, so my brain is very, very fuzzy. We've got growing regulation, we've got evolving stakeholder expectations. When we think of evolving stakeholder expectations, I picture things like in Australia, and I know in other parts of the world, we have a growing or hopefully stabilizing cost of living crisis. These are challenges that companies like mine have to grapple with. We have also increasingly got to look at multi-stakeholder perspectives. There is no sort of single unified position on many of these topics. So that in itself can be a challenge. I think back to just this concept of change, and as someone who has the amazing opportunity to lead a human rights program for a corporate, I think subjectively it's really interesting as I reflect on this topic, because at the same time as I objectively see change, I don't personally feel change. And I think because I can look back to things like COVID, and we have had processes or issues that have come up before. I think human rights in itself is fundamentally dynamic. And so we have had instances where we've had to evolve. For COVID, it meant pivoting from doing in-person audits to desktop audits, which some of us probably never thought we would conduct, but we did it and we continued to be effective. So I think I have this quiet optimism that we can be effective. I think I share some of the concerns around it does feel like we have been talking about these topics for a very long time now. And maybe that's where I pivot back to our experience and what Woolworths Group is seeing. I think maybe, I don't know whether it's because of, as well as, or in spite of, but we're at that hype cycle for sustainability. We're no longer at that peak. We are on that sort of downward trend. But I think potentially one of the positives of that is that more and more companies are moving to value and impact. So gone hopefully are the days where we're all talking and talking and talking. We're actually looking at what's the action, what's the impact. We need to have tangible impact in order to move forward. So I think that being a positive, at least in my space especially. And so we as a business have had to get really clear on our guiding principles as we look to this next horizon. So things like value and being impact driven are absolutely core. Being much more focused on materiality rather than that full breadth. How do we deliver impact by being more focused on materiality? I think acknowledging that we have to be adaptive to change. We're facing so much uncertainty. To navigate that, you have to be adaptive. There's no more set and forget. It's being adaptive and responsive, which is the case for pretty much any human rights program. I think another key fundamental is progress over perfection. This ideal state of perfection we're not going to achieve. So progress continually is much better than this unattainable view of perfection. And then I think now more than ever, I know many of us have been saying this for decades, but partnerships and collaboration, none of these challenges that we're talking about are unique to any one of us in the room. For many of us as a retailer, we share supply chains with many of our peers. So this idea that any of us are going to solve any of this alone is just obsolete, it's naive. So I think collaboration, partnerships, they're not only nice to have, they're absolutely non-negotiable.
Wonderful. Thank you for starting us on a transition to something a little more constructive. Right. I don't imagine anyone in the audience still wants us to talk about just how terrible the current situation is. I also was intrigued by this idea of the sort of the hype cycle that we are. Helena Helmerson, who's the former CEO of H&M, was on the Quizzer board with me, gave a talk recently, and she articulated a similar sort of thing that sustainability has had a moment of hype, and then to some extent in general led to disappointment. And of course, we're facing challenges that are beyond any we expected. But we also have a moment when it's incumbent on us, it's essential for us as practitioners to prove that this is of value. And you started down that path. So I'm going to stay with you, Rachel. Talk more about, what are those areas of materiality and specific value that you are exploiting as a human rights person and a business person tries to sort of push forward this agenda in your company?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's very topical for our business at the moment. I think gone are the days where human rights can only survive because it's the right thing to do. It is absolutely the right thing to do, but we have to explain that back to business in much more broader terms. So what is the commercial value? What is the social value, the impact value? What impacts can we have? And so I think many of us know this in this room, but drawing that really direct correlation between what happens in our external environment and supply chain disruptions. So it goes to the value for business in terms of resilience, the sustainability of a business model. I think making that case is quite fundamental for any human rights practitioner as you talk about that back to your business. So I find myself very lucky. I think I have a very supportive business who fundamentally accept that human rights is the right thing to do and it has commercial value. And so for us, increasingly what we're looking to do is move away from the idea of respect human rights. And I say this only because what we actually want to see ourselves doing is moving to advancing human rights. And I think for any practitioner in the room, they'll get that quite nuanced distinction between the respect and advance. And for me, that goes to, and I touched on it before, but collaboration. We participate in the Consumer Goods Forum. For anyone who doesn't know, 400 of the biggest, potentially some of the biggest brands across the world, CEO-led. But as part of that, one of my roles is a co-chair on the Human Rights Coalition. So some really like-minded businesses, many of who are in the room and really excited to work with. But how do we take the learnings that each of us have? Because there's so much IP that exists in this room. There's so many fabulous programs. But how do we bring all of that together into one virtuous cycle of continuous learning? I think each of these topics should be pre-competitive. There should be no competitive advantage for something like human rights. So how do we work together to share learnings and to start to bring scale and value? And again, bringing it back to this value cycle in terms of a value equation for a commercial entity, it gets to efficiencies for human rights practitioners. It gets to efficiencies of supply chains. It gets to reducing risk exposure. So we're working towards the development of a concept we're calling a ethical recruitment marketplace, which hopefully I'll get to touch on a bit later. But I think this is where we're starting to see the absolute value. It's that collaboration at scale.
Thank you for teasing that concept, and we'll definitely come back to it. But staying for a moment on the question of value to Woolworths as a company. I mean, to what extent have you had to, wanted to, been able to quantify the value, or is it something where at least the company is committed already upfront to the idea of human rights, and you don't really have to make a sort of a detailed case, but you can make a more general case? Because I think that's sort of those of us who struggle both in business and outside business to get more business to do more on human rights. The persuasive arguments, what really works and what doesn't. What can we learn from your experience?
Yeah, again, another great question. I think for me at least, it's probably twofold. I think I am incredibly lucky, the business that I work for. It's a very values and purpose-driven business. And so human rights has been at the core of what we do for a very long time now. Our program's been in place since at least 2018. But I think a distinguishing moment for Woolworths was 3 years ago, we identified our first case of modern slavery in our supply chain. So it became not just an academic conversation or a sort of, it became practical. It was, we have a very live issue in our supply chain. And I think we took the approach where we have shared that with our business very openly. We shared the situation workers found themselves in and just the horrendous circumstances. And I think for any business, when you are faced with understanding, again, this idea it's moving beyond the academic, this is a very real situation in your supply chain. Nobody wants a supply chain that fosters that sort of environment. And so I think it has been, as much as it was a horrid situation, I think the silver lining of that has been it is very real for our business. We know it's happened before, it could happen again. So it is a constant for us around how do we move that dial forward? How do we advance human rights? And for us, it's now moving beyond the reactivity, the identifying non-conformances and remediating into how do we actually identify patterns? How do we identify the grassroots drivers and the systemic conditions that are causing these situations in all of our supply chains? How do we take those learnings and then amplify them to work together? Because I think it's really lowest common denominator. If there are weak supply chains anywhere, they affect all of us. So it's not about just trying to say, we have to do this because it's the right thing. As I keep saying, it's because this affects all of us. So we need to lift that tide and we need to work together.
Great. Perfect segue back to you, Elaine. The idea of working on a sort of a sector or an industry, and particularly promoting value as the reason for moving forward, for collaboration, for action. Speak to us about the work at Design for Freedom.
Yeah, it would be, can I just kind of add to something that Rachel was saying, where you're saying that you've got, you work for an organization that's really supportive, kind of values aligned and behind the work of human rights. I think it's worth kind of mentioning that there are lots of organizations that where that is not the case, where that's not the norm. And certainly I, for one, working in the construction sector, had to come up with a really clear business case back to the board with a commercial link to actually doing good, delivering human rights programs. And I think that presents challenges and opportunities, but I also think it's the counterbalance to organizations where there is values alignment and where there is support and where actually potentially the resources come through for you to be able to do your work. That's not necessarily the norm. I felt the need to be the counterbalance there. I was perhaps a bit jealous, Rachel, of your situation.
But you were able to make the case.
Able to make the case, able to undertake flagship projects and to deliver on that work. But actually, I always think of construction sector as being a bit like the canary in the room. As soon as the economy starts to go bad, it draws back. It's counting, the pennies. And one of the first things often to go or to be pulled away is that budget around human rights. And and I think that not having the full engagement of the chief finance officer or them being very, really clear, it is unhelpful.
So bring us back to the design. No, that was a great digression and follow up. But you also now have a industry-wide strategy in a sense with different levels of advocacy and different types of advocacy.
Yeah. So again, I think back to a point that Rachel made about not just about respecting human rights, but about advancing and supporting human rights. I think that's why I stepped away to work for Design for Freedom, so that I could work more closely internationally with the global construction sector. And we do that through essentially three principles. So find and address forced and child labour in construction, product and material supply chains. Pursue ethical decarbonisation and prioritise circularity. Now, I mention those things because they're all interlinked, but in different geographies, in different situations, I would lead my conversation with perhaps in a different way. So I might talk more in India about circularity and the social values, but essentially the driver is about the elimination of forced and child labour and supporting and upholding human rights. So I think for me, Design for Freedom offers that opportunity to engage more broadly with the construction sector. So it started in the US in 2020. There's the 100 plus of the biggest players in the construction I say the built environment ecosystem, let's say. So not just those who are building, not just those who are manufacturing, but also those who are investing in, are insuring, are designing, are the architectural community. Because at each of those stages, there will be a level of agency that actually has an impact on what is procured and to what standard that is procured. So, so for me, that's where the opportunity and the excitement lies.
And it's recruiting, as you suggest, new actors to the space, and an industry that really, I mean, right, we have discussed in communities like this labor in construction, but you're talking about construction procurement and trying to cascade standards, sort of verifiable actions throughout a supply chain that has really been sort of untouched by the human rights agenda, in a sense, or human rights advocacy agenda.
Yeah, and also engaging with those who are delivering in the supply chain. So, I've been listening attentively, yesterday and today to the inputs from migrant workers and migrant workers' bodies in the room. And I think one of the things that struck me on a recent supply chain visit, actually to India, was that I think I can easily think about the migrant worker community as transitory, so moving back and to or moving around. But there I have a deep connection with a migrant community that has been there for 15 years with no rights, kind of suffering the consequences of not having those rights from that interstate migration as well, actually. So I think connecting some of those stories with actors within the ecosystem who would not normally, so a dialogue between somebody that had been working, a child labor in the sandstone sector, and a CEO, making those different connections, and I guess giving voice. There are things that I shouldn't be saying. There are things that the ecosystem needs to hear, but from those people who are most impacted by the decisions that are being made.
So incorporating in Design for Freedom and the work, the Grace Farms Foundation, the whole range of people who are affected, and from businesses to include also affected
absolutely
people.
And I think it's so important, because those stories, some of that we've heard today and yesterday, are so powerful, and emotion travels faster than information.
Yeah. Getting back to this idea, Pan, of the sort of specific value, right? The kinds of actions, the kinds of techniques, the points, the data points, the stories that mobilize us out of the sort of potential morass that we're in. I mean, you're working a lot with suppliers and others. How do you see the business value of human rights accruing or being understood by the stakeholders that you're working with?
I think on the business side, it's a mixed story. Sometimes when we talk about human rights and business value, there's some issues where we can make a strong case, and there are other issues where the case is less persuasively taken or received. I think an example we normally give is responsible recruitment has more benefits than just protecting human rights. If you draw it to making a business case, I think at the core of responsible recruitment is making sure that the right person with the right qualification gets the job without negative consequences attached to that process. And what that means simply is that when you implement a responsible recruitment model, you implement more measures to have transparency, controls over your recruiters, making more clear what the manpower needs are within the company, and making sure that your partners are aware about that your CSO or NGO partners are able to help you and check to make sure that the workers are being recruited in the way that you've set out in your policies. And so there's business value to getting the right workers, right, and making sure that they aren't recruited through exploitative brokerage practices. And so in those kinds of cases, the business value is more clear. There are some other issues and instances where it isn't so clear. I think to draw on examples where we are now in Thailand, suppliers, when they take on more social responsibility commitments, I think one of the comments you normally get is, why should we exceed the legal requirements here, and why should we take on increasing commitments, because that's okay here. And so in those instances, it's a delicate balance, but also like I said, going back to the need for a strong ecosystem where the commitments towards this are reinforced over time, where we continue to find ways to make sure that the commitments or implementation that are done by local suppliers are well supported all throughout. There will be instances where I think here in Thailand, in the seafood sector, we've seen production costs increase because of that. And what is sustaining that commitment, I think, is clear buyer signaling that these commitments do have purchase. And so there are some areas where there's clear business value, and there's some where it's more difficult.
So buyer signaling, continue to communicate it, continue to hold people accountable for implementing it. Sort of as a Southeast Asian, as a Thai organization, with whom are you advocating so that signal, those messages come across despite the noisy environment that we find ourselves in?
I think, well, with all stakeholders really, with buyer groups or international retailers and brands that do have production here or source from Thailand, there's also work that we do with them to make sure that responsible recruitment remains on the agenda and is part of conversations around procurement practices and purchasing, that priority continues to be there. But conversely, from the buyer's perspective, there's also a need for buyers to know that the efforts being taken up by suppliers in Thailand are actually achieving the impacts and outcomes that we desire. So when a supplier says that they've been adopting responsible recruitment practices or employer pays principle, what does that look like in the factory or inside workplaces or from the experience of workers? And there, what we find is that an important mechanism to ensure that there is continued support from buyers or downstream actors is to demonstrate that their programs and implementation have effectiveness, right? And so that effectiveness check is an important part, because without that assurance, what assurances will a buyer or downstream actors have that these markets are maturing or making progress where the outcomes matter? Another piece, I think, a cross-cutting theme that we usually emphasize is the importance of worker verification. Sometimes when we look at global programs or interventions or support, we words like management systems come up a lot, right? And risk assessment and effectiveness checks. But I think core to that is worker verification as well. That tends to be something that's missing in a lot of the implementation that we see. Actually, last week I was in an audit where this factory had perfect management system. There was a policy to check on on-site contract on-site service providers. They conduct internal audits every year. They look at all the freely chosen employment standards. They have interview tools. What they were missing was somebody to interview the workers and check whether these systems are being in place. And so where in that factory, what we found was, although there was a commitment towards EPP systems, procedures in place, the workers still paid recruitment fees. So this aspect of worker verification is very important and something that's challenging for companies to do, but again, it stresses the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration, where local NGOs, like many in this room, can support in developing the correct tools, interviewing techniques, or providing assistance in doing worker interviews to make sure that we mainstream their input into our efforts globally. Thanks,
Ben. Let's talk further a little about collaborations. Rachel, back to you. You mentioned the Consumer Goods Forum, Human Rights Coalition. I mean, of course, we are all hopeful that collaborations are essential, as you say. No individual institution, no matter where it sits in the supply chain, can do it alone. And yet, the companies that you are in partnership with are under pressure like other companies are as well. What do you hope will be the conversation in the CGC among the businesses as you respond to the current operating environment? I know that's a little bit tricky because you're not in control of these other businesses, you're a partner to them, and yet it seems essential if we're talking about and everyone is experiencing these dynamic and chaotic operating situations that the coalitions themselves adjust, the partnerships adjust also.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. I think we all operate in a globalized world. We have very similar supply chains. And I think there is that recognition, whether it's sort of an overt or implied recognition, that respecting advancing human rights is good for business. As I said, it's about resilient supply chains. It comes back to a sustainable business model. In terms of the CGF work, if I start with the work Woolworths have done, just as a precursor to coming to the CGF, when we identified modern slavery, we did a lot of work. It's been 3 years of really hard work. And I think a really key aspect of that is to note that progress in this space is not linear. So I think just recognizing that as a starting point, it comes to the point around collaboration, because this lack of linearity makes it really hard to do yourself. So when we uncovered modern slavery, the first thing anyone wants to do is to remediate. So we worked really hard over the space of around 2 years to remediate. But then just some really interesting aspects when we actually talked to workers, understanding that actually the fees remediation was not the most important to those workers. While they were very grateful, what they actually wanted to see was improved housing conditions, because that affects their day-to-day life. So just understanding the impacts from the worker perspective was quite illuminating in the way we were running our program. It also became, again, touching on what Pen said, it became really obvious to us that while our supplier had intended to have quite good processes and policies and controls, they thought that workers were not paying recruitment fees. But what was happening was, even though they were paying to the recruitment agent was double dipping. And so they were getting fees irrespective of that. So I think that then became very obvious to us that we are not going to make a dent if we are only focusing on our relationship with the supplier. So I think for any human rights due diligence program, you have to expand your circle of influence. You have to look at that full spectrum of the supply chain. So for us from there, we worked with On the Level to initiate a pilot in Nepal with recruitment agents to look at that accreditation program. This is trying to be very quick on what is a 3-year, very complex process. Our learning from that was, again, it's not enough for it to be the right thing to do. There has to be supply and demand principles. You have to do the push and the pull aspect to that. And that's not something that we can do alone. So I think after 3 years of work and multiple streams of different pilots, we recognized that we were probably at the end of the impact that we could have on our own. So we have taken those learnings, and I think the other key learning actually is when you look at that full spectrum of the recruitment journey, there are multiple amazing programs of work that are already in existence, but everything's in silos. And so without a really knitted, joined up approach, we're not really able to affect that full supply chain journey. And I think that, at least from my perspective and the work we've been doing, is the gap in the market at the moment. So we have tried to take those learnings and we've taken it to the Consumer Goods Forum, the Human Rights Coalition. And as a group, we are working towards the concept of an ethical recruitment marketplace. And so this is the idea where you map that full length of the supply chain, you recognize the role of buyers and suppliers and recruitment agents and workers, that full multi-stakeholder approach. And so overlaying that full journey with every program and partner that exists and operates in this space, and creating a non-competitive environment where we have this virtuous cycle, because it has to be focused on continuous learning, continuous drives, continuous inputs. And you try to create the market environment for ethical recruitment to finally become the norm, because you're acknowledging finally that there has to be the supply and demand principles applied to it. I think that's been the unspoken component for so long, where we've all just hoped, and it's been the elephant in the room, but if we actually acknowledge that this is the part that we have to really put the pressure on and bring everyone together in this multi-stakeholder environment. So I think that's the latest work for the Consumer Goods Forum. We're hoping to spend the next 6 months building, co-creating, because I think the main recognition is there is so much IP. Everyone is an expert in this space, but none of us are going to solve it by ourselves. None of us are going to get it right by ourselves either. So maintain that curiosity, But for us, we'll work on that for the next 6 months with a hope to have something to launch within 6 months. And we want it to be open sourced. So it's something available to everybody. As I keep saying, there's no competitive advantage in this space. And I think if we all work together, the commercial impacts at the end of it is that we're reducing the risk profile for all of us. We're creating efficiencies, and we're also doing the right thing.
Awesome, thank you. Dipping into my own experience for a second, right? Certainly the idea that markets are one solution, not to every human rights problem, but to those that are amenable to them, in this case, an ethical recruitment marketplace, or some other way of putting buyers together with suppliers, be it for labor or more generally for products on in terms of service. It requires transparency. Transparency can be generated by technologies. We as an investor are investing in technologies that create supply chain transparency and worker engagement directly. But these approaches, the market-driven approaches, the technology-driven approaches, they offer a new way in to the problems of visibility, the problems of transparency, the signals that travel up and down but often get lost. We've discussed a little bit that within your work, you're also trying to find new ways of sharing information, some of them technologically facilitated. So last question to you to talk a little bit about that. And then we'll take questions from folks online, assuming there are some, TT. Great. That seems like a lot. Yeah, over to you.
I just wanted to add, kind of building on what Rachel was saying, I think that the construction sector as a whole has a lot to learn from other sectors who have been under much more scrutiny, certainly in terms of collaboration. So I don't see enough collaboration in the construction sector in the way that I might see it in textiles or in food. And interestingly, you made me think of almost like an unusual collaboration whereby we have in the UK an initiative that is undertaken by an investment group, Find It, Fix It, Prevent It, who are actually driving the construction sector through engaging with them to share more of the information that they have between them. So it's kind of quite, I think that's quite unusual, but interesting and shows some promise. So, sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Are you using innovative approaches or technology to facilitate the work that you're trying to do?
Yeah, so we've done a big piece of work looking at interoperability of various platforms and what that means for construction. And there's some really exciting pieces of work underway. I think at early stages with a heavy focus on materials tracking. So again, I kind of in terms of construction products and materials, I see this in terms of environmental product declarations, that somehow it is possible to get the data that you require right to the end of the supply chain or back to raw materials. But I can't have the same in terms of the human rights data. It's almost like emphasis from the company in terms of the willingness to extract that information, but not apply that in terms of the human rights piece, which is why I'm so enthusiastic about the Global Data Partnership Against Forced Labor. And I think the opportunity for construction to step up, because what I see is a whole load of technological developments going on in the construction sector. So I think of a smart cement that repairs itself. I think of smart paint. I think of smart dust and how that is used in terms of helping those who are involved in kind of urban development track what needs to be changed. But again, I don't see those things yet being applied. It's like they're nascent in terms of being applied to the question of human rights in supply chain. So I remain like wholly optimistic and driven and, you know, consistent and persistent that the construction sector has a lot to learn, but also potentially working with those unusual actors, perhaps not necessarily those that we first think of, such as the architects and the designers and students, we can add something to this space.
So broadening out beyond quote unquote the usual suspects, and also embracing these newfangled technologies, which is also very much what we try to support in at least in my day job. It's a nice segue and gives me a chance to plug our work. Happy to talk more about it at any time. Let's see, what people at home are thinking, or people online here. And we'll take, maybe throw them out and we'll see where we go,
So far, we have 5 questions. Shall I give you all 5, or shall I go 3 first? Let's do 3. So the first one is, given the current dynamics, resources for movement and support have become increasingly restricted. They're already limited, and the reduction in support from USAID has made the situation more difficult. What impact might they have on social and civil society organizations, and what could the future hold for them? One second, please. The second one is, many SMEs believe that following ethical and human rights standards is too costly and use this to justify non-compliance. How can we shift this mindset and help them see that respecting human rights is a responsibility, not an option? And the third one is, Thailand is making an effort to raise the legal requirements by having human rights due diligence legislations, but businesses are pushing back, saying that there are also existing legislations covering human and labor rights. What is the view of brands sourcing, and how can they support raising the bar to address and prevent labor rights violations in the supply chain?
Thank you. Let's focus on the latter two. I think we've talked some about the impact on civil society. I think it's, those of us who are working in civil society, it's fairly clear to us. What about SMEs and the way in which they react to the standards and I guess I don't remember the framing exactly, but consider sort of cost and impediment. And then whoever would like to speak also to Thailand's efforts to create tighter requirements, and how should we collectively, or you all individually, work in support of those. I suppose I'm always intrigued by the role of brands and buyers that source in this region, and how and where they're willing to get involved in support of legislation that actually levels the playing field up for everybody else. So I can call on you, or you can volunteer yourselves. Go ahead.
So your question regarding SMEs and how to engage them in human rights due diligence efforts. In my experience within PLC, there was only really one driver, which was commercial benefit. And in order for there to be commercial benefit to that supplier to engage in what it was we were requiring of them, there had to be commitment, so a medium to long-term commitment to that supplier. So kind of moving supply undermined the work of the human rights program or the human rights team. But I think the commercial benefit has to be there for those SMEs who are engaging.
Fair.
No,
Please
just add
do.
to that, completely agree. The commercial element is absolutely critical, and that's what we're trying to do with the marketplace. But I think I would maybe add a few other multifaceted elements. And I say this from our experience talking with suppliers regularly about the need for respecting human rights in their supply chain. From our perspective, their supply chain is our supply chain. When you look beyond tier one and down that full length of the supply chain, it's that one supply chain. For us, I think there are multiple lenses. I think one is the social license. I think that's an increasing area. I think increasing regulatory compliance. So even if a business doesn't have regulation in their country, in order for us to be able to import, they still need to comply with human rights expectations. So it comes back to their opportunity for commercial benefit and sending or sourcing countries. I think the other element, and maybe this is from the perspective of a customer-facing business, customers do not want products that are made from forced labor. So I think back to that basic premise that the end user is the customer, and maybe it's social license, but they will not buy your product if it's proven to be any level of modern slavery in that supply chain. So that for us is also some really key conversations that we have with suppliers.
And one of the persistent laws, or at least the laws with some persistent enforcement, is the forced labor trade related bans, right? Which have
Completely.
geopolitical components to them as well, but it's it's clear also that it's difficult to import things that have demonstrated forced labor
Absolutely.
in production as well.
Maybe just one final add. I think it would be remiss as well not to acknowledge there are many, many fabulous businesses out there, many who take this area incredibly serious and have amazing programs that are way better than ours. I think we're continually learning from many of our suppliers as well. And so I think these conversations are incredibly important, and we need to focus on what needs to change. But on the flip side of that is also recognizing good when good happens.
Fair enough. And being able to find them and, Elaine, as you said, give longer term contracts and give preferential purchasing practices, et cetera. Do you have anything to add to this, or do you want to take the risk of answering the next two questions?
I think I'll just echo that commercial support is really important for SMEs, but also there's a need for SMEs to have, I think, clear guidances on what can be done. It's oftentimes very difficult to apply the same standards of big business on HRDD or social responsibility on an SME. So being consultative in that approach, I think, is important.
Could I just add to that? Again, you're saying where there is consumer or customer pressure, that's what they want to see. But I think in construction, products and materials, who's asking what pavement they're walking on, where it came from, who put in the steel beams in it? Nobody's asking those questions. They're not applying that same level of pressure. And I think this is, for me, where governments need to step up in terms of the public monies the massive amount of public monies that are spent on construction and infrastructure, and actually take the lead in demonstrating what good human rights due diligence looks like in relation to construction, because the pressure isn't coming from consumers. I would love it to be. I would love you all to go home and sit and look at the buildings that you walk past and start to ask the questions, because they're equally as important as any you might ask about tea, coffee, or clothes.
So there's an emerging coalition between government for public procurement, responsible business, consumers, citizens as well. Do we have time for the last two questions and see where we go? Neil? Good.
There's actually three now.
Okay. Go for it.
Sure. So one is, I see that the process of hiring migrant workers can sometimes become complex for having multiple layers. So for example, recruitment agency 1 in country A, recruitment agency 2 in country A, recruitment agency 3 in country B, in other words, destination country. In such cases, how can recruitment fees be eliminated? And then we have a question for Woolworth Groups. How does Woolworth Group hold the suppliers accountable if complaints were filed regarding the labor rights violations, for example, forced labor, rights to organize, freedom of association, etc.? What are the due processes and best practices? Any good case studies? And then we have one for Elaine. Can Elaine explain more the practical solutions Grace Farms is working on right now to address the forced and child labor in construction industry, besides talking to migrant workers and gathering the information for them? How do you exert pressure on the rights violators and hold them accountable?
That's a lot to try and cover in like 90 seconds. Maybe 120 seconds. Two questions. Let me try and answer the first one, I guess, because in my mind is the current chaotic, dynamic, painful operating environment has an effect on all of us, but not on everything equally. And so when I think about our portfolio, certainly where we anticipated human rights due diligence to be extended deeper in supply chains, because of the EU legislation, that's gotten more difficult. But because of tariffs, supply chain transparency is now at a premium, and traceability actually has a chance as well. And so as I hear that first question about the multiple layers of labor recruiters and intermediaries, whether they be sort of labor intermediaries or material intermediaries, there's a real opportunity to use technology and a demand and some products out there that can enable us to succeed. Now there was a question to Woolworths about your complicated processes, and also Elaine, yours. So maybe Rachel, is there a 30-second version of the answer, or do you just want to point people to your website?
Quite a complex question. Maybe the one thing I would say is for our program, I'd like not to think of it as compliance. I think we like to think of it as more collaboration and partnership with our suppliers, because we really take the approach that we want to know about the challenges. We want to shine a light on them. I think the more it's a compliance-based program, things get hidden, and that's when things really get bad. So that's where I see our program really starting to expand even more into the future. It's partnership and collaboration and shared problem solving. That's the 30-second snapshot of what could be a half-hour answer.
Want my 30-second answer now? Okay, yeah. So 2 things. So one of the things that we're doing is raising awareness of the most vulnerable, so the materials most vulnerable to forced and child labour. So you can access this within our Design for Freedom international guidance, newly published, and it also has a toolkit on the back of it, which allows you to, in one place, understand the complexities in relation to some of those key materials like cements, rubbers, metals, and others, and then takes you straight through to, okay, what are you going to do about it? Because, I mean, that's the bottom line, isn't it? We got to do stuff.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Pan and Rachel and Elaine, for this. There's so much good work that's happening as represented by these good people on this panel, by all of you in the room. I think we collectively sympathize with one another about the, again, chaotic, dynamic, and troubling environment we sit in with each other. Many of the solutions that you described are solutions that were necessary 5 years ago, now, and into the future. There are opportunities, particularly on marketplaces, on the leveraging of technology, the identification and the communication of signals up and down, market-based signals, I think, that give us particular reason to be focused on them and optimistic going forward. That identification of clear value as opposed to just expecting each other to do the right thing. It was a theme that clearly came across. Anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks to the panel. Appreciate it.